welcome to Fishing Without Bait, a lifetime without definitive expectations, where we help people explode into their lives through full impact mindfulness. The only entrance fee is the honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness to try. If you have a few particles of those, welcome aboard. You're on your way. I'm Jim Ellermeyer. I'm a behavioral health therapist, continuing our conversation with Chris Whitlatch, author of Notorious Pittsburgh. So we were talking about, you gave a very detailed explanation of the rise of the massage parlors, the rise of the vice trade, and the individuals who fought over it.
It's amazing to me that would even be allowed to take place here in Pittsburgh, but it was. You're talking about a period with, it was towards the end of the golden age of the Pittsburgh family. Here in Pittsburgh in the 70s and the early 80s. But it was still surprising that they would allow that much fighting to go on in a small piece of their business. Likewise, I think you had some what we would consider some of the stronger leadership during that time. You had Mayor Richard Henkel, who was considered, one of the great visionaries here in Pittsburgh. Why did he allow this to happen? Well, he tried. Lawyers are good here in Pittsburgh on both sides of the fence. But yeah, it happened to where people were fighting over what wasn't necessarily a large criminal enterprise, but one that was lucrative enough that you would fight. And it was all controlled by one person, George Lee, until he was assassinated. And then the real fighting, the real war began between his underlings that he actually brought into the business. So they fought over who would control his empire afterwards, and it never did get reassembled into an empire.
After he was killed, and there was 3 people that tried to take over things. But I think one of the most colorful characters was Tex.
Tex has a wonderful position here in Pittsburgh, I think. This is a very conservative town in its, moral views and its, in every way, I think. And here in Pittsburgh, Tex, you had a transvestite that was actually celebrated long time ago, back in the 70s and 80s. And it's still difficult. I mean, trans rights are in the news again.
Yes.
In many other states. And here in Pittsburgh, in a conservative area, they actually celebrated. They gave, the Post-Gazette gave Tex Gill the Dubious Man and the Dubious Woman of the Year award in the same year. And I think if you look back, there wasn't that understanding or that inclusion that is happening, but at least it was today that's happening, but at least there was that acceptance back then, which surprises the hell out of me.
and Tex was married to a woman.
Tex was married to a woman. They were seen on a regular basis in public here in Pittsburgh. And like I said, there was at least acceptance of Tex. And Tex is one of those big characters, wore suits and a big cowboy hat. I mean, Tex is one of those great characters that you would expect to see in a movie. In fact, I think they did try to do a movie a few years ago, and it just never was made about Tex's life, which would have been amazingly interesting. Tex was very public as a character, but very private in his own life.
So we start off with the vice serving the basic needs of the working man. Then Prohibition comes in for 10 years, which exploded the organized crime.
Yeah, well, you've got, I think you've got that in across the United States, that you can actually point to Prohibition being the sort of catalyst for organized crime across the country. It's when Lucky Luciano formed the commission. It sort of brought all of these disparate gangs together into strong families. And that's kind of what jump started here in Pittsburgh, those golden years for the Pittsburgh family. It started around that time, and it was really strong in the 50s and 60s. And it started to basically go on the wane in the late 70s and 80s as you had leaders die and new leaders come about, and they got themselves into businesses that the police are just not going to overlook, things like drugs. And that led to more of the sort of downfall of those golden years here in Pittsburgh for the family.
What it seemed to me that the police overlooked things that they believe weren't really harming anyone. I guess they believed that prostitution, those types of speakeasy things, were a nuisance, and they weren't going to do anything about it unless absolutely forced to.
Well, Jim, Carnegie was very beneficial to Pittsburgh, but so were the numbers runners in the Hill District, and so were some other individuals that were involved in illegal activities were propping up their own communities, were putting money back into their communities, were helping the less fortunate in their communities. So they were doing some of the work that you would expect out of the local government was actually being done by these individuals.
Well, for many of these folks, the door was closed to them as far as getting ahead in life. So the only thing that they could do was what numbers runners also did was they sold them hope.
Yes. Yeah. And they built ball fields and brought professional teams into the area and held picnics. And if even put food on people's table, and if there's no other option for you in your neighborhood or your community, I mean, how can you judge that? You can't.
I'm not justifying
it. You can't. I can't justify it either. But I can also say, I can't say I wouldn't. Take that generosity if I was in that situation. I would. Yes.
I'm not justifying the numbers game. However, it did give people hope, and they didn't cheat anybody. If you won, they paid you.
If you won, you got paid. Mm-hmm.
And they provided some employment, which wasn't rough back then. And you're right. They did put money back into the community.
Mm-hmm.
So that seemed to have changed with the advent of drug running.
Well, now the business gets rougher, as you said, right? It's not people, not playing the state lottery, but playing your local lottery, so to speak. It's not, someone paying for entertainment like gambling or sex or something like that. Now it's becoming a health issue for a community. It's becoming a crime issue for a community. And at that point, I think the government's decided they needed to crack down here. It was more than they could handle at that point.
And also it's the lure of money. When something becomes lucrative, many people begin to take notice.
Yes, and also, these businesses that are illegal businesses, how can they let another illegal business take that income? They can't. And so now you've got a lower barrier of entry, so to speak, into a violent, more rougher marketplace, and you're going to have that fighting that you had. It wasn't controlled as it was by organized crime as much, right? There was other players involved in that particular business.
Well, you described the three players very, very descriptively after Lee died, and some of them it was kind of like the Keystone Cops. I don't think they could find their way out of a lit room. Somehow they made money, but most of all, it was a brutality.
Well, it's interesting to me who George recruited for his business. for his empire, basically. And George's estate was a mess. He actually sat in cold storage. He couldn't even be buried because his estate was such a mess. And what ended up happening was it was just split. And so Nick DeLuca, who was a city firefighter before George brought him into the business, he got 3 or 4 of the parlors, so he got a good piece of the business. Tex Gill got another 3 or 4 parlors and got a good piece of the business. And then there was, my favorite guy, and oh man, I just forgot his name. While we're talking, Mel. Yeah, so Mel got to keep the stage, and the stage is where where the August Wilson Center is now. That was the most derelict block on Liberty at the time, and the stage was sort of the flagship of that derelict block. And Mel thought Mel was a used car salesman, right? Tex shoot horses. These aren't raised criminals, right? They're those that kind of were looking for a leg up, a better life, I think you could say. Or in Mel's case, maybe some fun, excitement. Yeah.
It sounded like none of them really enjoyed the money that they made. It sounds in your book, Chris, like they didn't make an exorbitant amount of money.
You didn't off of Vice. You made enough. They were able to, buy nicer houses, maybe move to a better neighborhood in some cases. But they weren't pulling down, massive amounts of money. And even when the IRS busted them for tax evasion, it was tax evasion on what the parlors took in. And it wasn't, the government didn't, unless they were hiding a lot of this, and I just never dug that out. The government did not bust them for more than, 80 to a couple $100,000 in their cases of tax evasion. And that was basically a year's income for the parlor. And we look at that today, and it doesn't sound like much. And it was decent back in the late 70s, but it wasn't like they were buying yachts or, taking, exorbitant trips or things like that. They were making a living at that time.
When we're talking about the psychology of these individuals, a lot of people have no desire to be wage earners, or what I would call wage slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be willing to take another, I would say, alternative method to make money.
Yeah, and I think, in these particular cases, what Nick DeLuca was doing was difficult. It's hard to be a firefighter. Tex was doing something he loved, but probably wasn't making a lot of money out of it. And this was a way to make some more money. And as I said, I think Mel this was exciting. It's a way to be a part of something.
You're a player.
You're a player. You're doing something. It's more exciting.
You're
right?
a pirate.
Yeah. You're a pirate. That's a good one. That's a good description.
Steve Jobs said there was 2 types of people with a spectrum in between in this world, Chris. You're people that prefer to be in the Navy and people who prefer to be pirates. But then we move into some rather deeper and darker characters, like Sasha Scott, Glenn Scott, Sue, Henkel. That could be a movie there.
Yeah, I don't think we realized, but we had a serial killer amongst us here in the 70s, late 60s into the 80s, and that's Richard Henkel. Before they shut him down, he didn't just kill people. I mean, he got enjoyment out of killing those people. He didn't just shoot you; he shot you several times. He
butchered them.
Yeah, so. There is that kind of person that would gravitate to that freedom and that excitement as well. And that element brings, trouble and darkness.
Well, yes. So tell us, describe the characters to us. Describe the Scotts. Describe Sue. Describe those people to us.
Yeah. So Sasha, Sasha had a rough start to her life, and by the age of 14, she was already involved in prostitution, and she bounced from one man to the next. She eventually married Glenn Scott, which is why she's known as Sasha Scott now. Glenn was a local businessman, but he obviously was involved in some extracurricular activities of some sort. He ends up dead very soon after they married. The likeliest suspect is Richard Henkel. He got them to basically, Henkel was one of the maybe pioneers of insurance fraud. Unfortunately, his version of insurance fraud is you ended up dead. He would get you to sign a insurance policy naming either he or his mother, and then he'd bump you off and they'd collect the money. His insurance schemes got more outlandish as things went. Ms. Scott never left work at the Genesis, which was one of the most famous, sort of the flagship massage parlor here in Pittsburgh. It was on Liberty Avenue. That building is not there anymore. It was redeveloped, but it was her home spot, so to speak. It was just up from the Gimbel's department store. And on, Christmas, right before Christmas, Henkel paid a taxi driver after he had gotten Scott to sign an insurance policy with him to deliver a brightly wrapped Christmas present straight to Sasha. And when Sasha opened the package, boom, it blew up and it killed her instantly. And it was one of the most infamous events here in Pittsburgh because it was during the Christmas season. It was seasonably warm that day. There were a lot of shoppers out on the streets, and they got showered with glass. It stopped traffic on Liberty. It caused such an uproar for Mayor Caligiuri and his staff that he closed every massage parlor. And they were closed for exactly 3 days. And the reason why it was 3 days is because the courts were closed on the 24th and the 25th for the Christmas holiday. And on the 26th, when they reopened, the lawyers had that injunction lifted and the massage parlors went right back to business.
So Sasha's dead. Her husband's dead.
Several others around her circle that she ran with end up dead as well. Bobby Pugh, who was a massage parlor who hung out with them, died as well, mysteriously. Henkel went on to kill Sue Dixon, who he was dating at the time and was working around that racket as well in some form or fashion. And then he got caught. He got caught because he got really, really bold with his last policy. Basically, he got Debbie Gentile, who was working for him and another businessman in some kind of maybe legitimate, maybe not legitimate business that he had his hands in, to sign an insurance policy that would pay if she was killed on an airplane or on airport property. And she left for California. He called her up, convinced her to fly back. She told a friend that dropped her off at the airport that she knew he was gonna kill her. And sure enough, she was found with, I think it was something like 47 stab wounds and 5 gunshot wounds in the back of a car, but she was killed on the old airport property in the hotel. And so the insurance company would have to pay, except the insurance company said, well, this is pretty convenient. So they fought paying it. And they fought paying it long enough that the police were able to catch up and put some of the evidence together. And they managed to nail Henkel for his murder of Gentile, not for any of the other activities, but for that particular murder. They were going for the death penalty. He basically bargained for life in prison and got it. Before that all happened, he attempted to break out of Western Penitentiary and nearly accomplished that and held hostages for 4 or 5 days. Um, and that was, big news in 1980.
We're going to continue our conversation with our next episode with local author Chris Whitlatch. And at the end of every podcast, of course, we offer a free prescription: fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Unplug your television and take up fishing. And for a truly mindful experience, we suggest that you fish without bait. Do a kindness for yourself and do a kindness for another. Forgive yourself and forgive another. If we are all not God's children, none of us are. Till all are free, none are free. Namaste.